Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar. My name is Melanie Borker, and I'm the Tri-State Regional Assistant Director of Alums for Campus Fairness. ACF harnesses the unique power of alumni to counter anti-Semitism and the demonization of Israel on our college and university campuses. We are dedicated to preventing discrimination and to holding educational institutions accountable for remaining pillars of truth and academic freedom. Over the last decade, and especially after October 7th, we've seen a rise in anti-Semitic and anti-Israel incidents on college campuses, including hate speech, vandalism, encampments, and even physical assaults. ACF is dedicated to combating this trend. We are the only organization engaging in educating alumni to counter anti-Semitism and the demonization of Israel on college campuses. We're a unified voice of over 66,000 alumni and counting. We put leaders on notice of anti-Semitic incidents and organize rapid responses. ACF has deployed billboards, created petitions, and has been featured in multiple news outlets to expose anti-Semitism and the double standards at schools following the October 7th Hamas terrorist massacre. We know that by harnessing the unique power of alumni, we can help build a better future for all students, regardless of their backgrounds or beliefs. We invite you to join us in this important work. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from Ben M. Freeman. Founder of the modern Jewish Pride movement, a leader, thinker, and educator, Ben is the author of the seminal Jewish Pride, Rebuilding a People, and its follow-up, Reclaiming Our Story, The Pursuit of Jewish Pride. He's just finished the final of his Jewish Pride trilogy, The Jews and Indigenous People. Educating, inspiring, and empowering, his work focuses on Jewish identity and historical and contemporary Jew hatred. A Holocaust scholar for over 15 years, Ben came to prominence during the Jeremy Corbyn Labour Party Jew hate crisis in the UK and quickly became one of his generation's leading Jewish thinkers and voices against Jew hate. Voted number 8 on the inaugural 25 Young Visionaries list by the Jerusalem Post and JNF USA, he's also a Jewish diplomat for the World Jewish Congress, a research fellow for the Institute of the Study of Global Anti-Semitism Policy, and a columnist for the Jerusalem Post. Ben is a strong voice in combating anti-Semitism and cultivating Jewish pride, and ACF is thrilled to have him speak with us. Please feel free to use the Q&A function to submit your questions throughout the webinar. Before we begin, I'd also like to introduce Michael Mantell, our ACF-Hunter College chapter leader, who continues to be instrumental in organizing ACF events. For those who don't already know him, Michael is a psychotherapist, educator, and the grandson of Holocaust survivors. In addition to leading our Hunter College chapter, Michael teaches modern Jewish history, facilitates a mitzvah project class, and serves as a board member of 3GNY. He's a strong advocate for our cause. I want to thank Michael for helping us organize this webinar, and I will now turn it over to him and Ben.
Thank you so much, Melanie and Trey and everyone at Alums for Campus Fairness, also known as ACF, for all of your help in making programs like these possible and for all the work ACF does combating Jew hatred on college campuses. I also want to thank all of the ACF chapter leaders for their work as well. And thank you to everyone here for being with us today and those viewing this recording. As always, I also got to give a shout out to my amazing parents who I owe the world to, including for gently challenging me on my uninformed opinions and beliefs when I was younger, suggesting that I do a little research and learn more about Israel and the history of the Jewish people, which led me to be the proud Jew that I identify as today. Something that has been a beautiful metamorphosis and one that is still ever evolving. I believe I fit the endearing term my father called me when I was younger, parpar, butterfly in Hebrew. And I want to give a very special thank you to Ben M. Freeman for joining us and lending us his time and expertise today. Not only is Ben an incredible writer, articulate, engaging speaker, but he is incredibly informed and knowledgeable and has been able to give a voice to what many of us Jews have been experiencing and feeling for years, but haven't been able to put the words to it until now. Not only that, Ben has been so generous with his time throughout the years. I want to say that I initially reached out to Ben 3 years ago when we, the current students, and some of us alumni were dealing with severe anti-Semitism at my alma mater. At that time, 2 current students, myself and another alum, took action and initiated a Title VI complaint against the university for discrimination. It just so happens that last week, the Office for Civil Rights, OCR, released a letter in regards to that complaint and 8 other complaints against CUNY, the City University of New York. Although we have been told as far as resolutions to these complaints go, we should be proud of what we were able to uncover and accomplish, as it's considered one of the quote unquote better ones. That said, we know our work is not done and that there are next steps that we have to take. So it is wonderful to come to this point almost 3 years later and have this discussion with Ben about Jewish pride on college campuses and beyond. Before we begin, I also want to ask everyone here to save the date for 3 upcoming programs. On Thursday, July 11th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, I will be hosting the premiere episode of 3G Thursdays, a program that spotlights 3Gs, grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. Joining me will be 3-time Emmy Award-winning journalist and Holocaust spokesperson, Dana Archin, who will be sharing her grandfather's testimony and speaking about the work she does to bring Holocaust testimony and education to the masses using media and storytelling. On Monday, July 27th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, I will be joined in conversation with the creative team and cast of the play October 7th in Their Own Words, which was just completing its New York City run last week. Anne and Philip, 2 Irish Catholic investigative journalists, will share clips from the show and will discuss what compelled them to write this play and the experience of getting it on stage in New York City. We'll be joined by 5 cast members as well. And on Sunday, August 11th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, a twist on my Sundays with Survivors program, we will be joined by Israeli actor and combat commander Yadin Gelman, who fought Hamas for 10 straight hours on October 7th. He will be sharing his harrowing experience with us. Throughout this program, please feel free to use the Q&A function to give your questions or comments to us so we can read it to you at the latter part of the program. So to start, I want to thank Ben M. Freeman for being here, giving us his time. And before we go into more questioning, can we start by you giving a little bit of information about who you are for those who don't know you, including how you came here to this place, having written 2 books, working on a 3rd one, and being the punam behind the Jewish Pride movement, being a voice for the Jews everywhere. What was the impetus for all of this?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you so much to you, Michael, and to ACF. You guys are doing incredible work. Listening to the Save the Dates is pretty remarkable what you're doing for your community. In terms of my work, I mean, it's really accidental. I was obsessed with history as a young person, and because of that became a Holocaust educator. And so I've always been involved in the Jewish world. I was telling you before we started that there was a brief moment where I worked for Tom Ford in fashion, but that was a brief hiatus. But really, pretty much all of my professional experience was in the Jewish organized world. So that was kind of ticking, and I was learning about the Jewish experience, particularly with the Holocaust, particularly with related to Jew hatred, anti-Semitism, obviously. But at the same time, I'm also a proud gay person. I'm a proud gay man. And that experience of coming to terms with my sexual orientation was incredibly instrumental in the work I'm doing now. So I realized as a young person, even though I felt ashamed, I felt like I didn't want to be gay, I realized something quite fundamental and actually, on one hand, incredibly obvious, but on the other hand, radical. And it was that I had done nothing wrong. And I really felt before that I had done something wrong, that there was something wrong with me. And in that moment, I realized that that was not the case. It was society's problem, not mine. And it wasn't like the next day I woke up and I was proud, but it started me on a path to pride, to LGBTQ plus pride. And I understood the framework and what you need to do to deal with your internalized homophobia and to not just become comfortable, but proud of your identity. These 2 experiences, identities, I guess, came to a head, married one another during the Corbyn Labour Jew hate crisis, which was mentioned in my bio. And for those of you who don't know, Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party from 2015 to 2020. He's actually standing in the neighbourhood next to mine, not mine, the neighbourhood next to mine next week, because we have an election next week. So he's not in the Labour Party now, but he's standing as an independent, and he is a racist. He is a kind of classic leftist anti-Jewish racist, anti-Zionist, and I joined a fight online to kind of take him down and really fought with the British Jewish community. And I saw 2 remarkable things. The first was the British Jewish community do something pretty extraordinary. For any of you who know British people, it's stiff upper lip, keep your head down, get on with it, don't cause a fuss. And that has also an attitude which has infiltrated our community, living here and being in this culture. But we would not shut up. We would not let it rest. They kept trying to make this go away. They kept trying to dismiss us. And the Jewish community rose up and spoke with more or less one voice. And we had Orthodox rabbis and Reform rabbis and liberal rabbis writing letters as one, which was remarkable. So that was inspiring. But then at the same time, I saw often high-profile left-wing Jews. They couldn't quite join the fight. They couldn't quite describe Corbyn accurately. They were like, no, he's ignorant, he means well, and they were talking around it, and it wasn't the bullseye we needed, right? And we think about that now. When a statement is made, does it hit? Does it hit the idea? Does it go for it? These people were not doing that, and that just led me to reflect on my own experience as a gay person growing up. And I just kind of realized, and listen, I would love to say that it was like a light bulb moment. I honestly don't remember. Maybe I can lie and say that it was a light bulb moment, but I realized over a period of time, I presume, that we needed a pride movement, that the Jews need a pride movement that would educate, inspire, and empower us in the way that other pride movements do those things for their respective communities. And it's not necessarily, especially in the UK, it's not necessarily the norm for Jews to be loud and proud and confident. But I realized, again, reflecting on my experience as a gay person, that is what we need, especially at this moment. But it's remarkable that we're sitting here in 2024, and I started writing my first book, Jewish Pride, on October 4th, 2019. So almost 5 years ago. And as you and I were saying just before, it's just got worse and worse and worse. So the need for Jewish pride has just become more and more important as the situation has unfolded.
And from the beginning of your first book until now, and then working on your next book, was this something that you knew was going to happen in this order, Jewish pride, and then reclaiming our story? How did you come from where you were to developing this narrative?
You know, it's really funny because I probably would describe myself as a writer, or maybe I would say to people I'm an author, but for the longest time I didn't, because I was a teacher and I was writing the first two books while I was teaching, and that was kind of my primary focus. So I decided to write the first book. I started writing it. Now it's so crazy. I started writing it before I had a book deal, which seems very bold and very confident. But so I started writing it, got a book deal, and it was a one book deal. It was for that book. And I hadn't really thought about the next step, which is kind of unusual for me. I'm always thinking about the next step, and I find it hard to live in the moment. But I think that it was such an enormous undertaking that I couldn't help but focus on what I was doing. Because as I said, I wasn't a writer. I was a teacher who decided to write a book. And then, you know, it was during COVID when the first book, Jewish Pride, came out. And I did hundreds of speaking engagements from Hong Kong, where I lived at the time, online. And I think where we spoke, I was in Hong Kong. And in so many of the conversations, people spoke about one specific chapter of Jewish Pride, which was about internalized anti-Jewishness. And in that book, I kind of spoke about it in the most extreme way, the anti-Zionist Jews. And I'm sure that we'll cover them in this conversation. But people were writing to me, and in those conversations, they were telling me and saying, you know, this book helps me deal with my internalized anti-Semitism. And that just made me think, well, there must be more to this story. So I decided to write a second book. And then I started thinking about educate, inspire, and empower. You know, I mentioned those three words in my spiel a minute ago. And I realized that, you know, once I decided to write a second book and embarked on that, I realized that, okay, the first book was inspire. It was like, this is why we need a Jewish pride movement. This is what Jewish pride is. Very inspirational. The second book is a deep dive. It's the one right there, the blue book. That's why I refer to them as the white book and the blue book. Yay, thank you very much. So I started writing that, and it's a deep dive into internalized anti-Semitism. And it's one of the first books in a century. And it's really frustrating to me because the LGBTQ plus community is quite well versed in the conversation of internalized homophobia and what else. But we're not, as in the Jewish community, not well versed, and we don't discuss internalized anti-Semitism. So I wanted to be solutions oriented. That's kind of how I am in my life. I'm always saying to my friends, okay, let's think of a solution. So I didn't just want to present a problem and be like, not only does everyone hate us, but some of us have issues with ourselves. I wanted to always be offering people hope and working towards a solution. So that became the empowerment, the skills and the tools to identify and then deal with internalized anti-Semitism. And then, okay, educate. The third bit, right? What did I want when I decided I wanted it to be a trilogy? I mean, like Lord of the Rings, I guess. So again, very bold. But when I decided I wanted it to be a trilogy, and I thought, okay, what is this next part gonna say? If this is the last thing I ever write, I wanted it to leave Jews in a stronger position to define our own identities, because that's what I always say. One of the main things about Jewish pride is that we're the ones who get to define Jewish identity. Jews reject non-Jewish definitions of the Jewish experience, and we tell our story. But to do that, we need to know our story. So this third book was an investigation into Jewish history, and is, as was mentioned at the beginning, is called The Jews and Indigenous People, because I would argue through my analysis that we are indigenous to the land of Israel. We are as indigenous to that land as any indigenous people are to theirs. It's a deep emotional bond which exists between us and the land itself, not just the territory, not just the borders, but the soil itself. It's why Jews get off the plane, or hundreds of years ago got off their donkeys and they kissed the ground in the land of Israel. So that said, I wanted to leave Jews in a stronger position to define our identities. So it's kind of a neat little package of educate, inspire, and empower.
It's quite beautiful. It's been one of my go-to gifts for people, and every single time people are telling me that they are grateful, again, that people are grateful that you're putting into words articulately in writing, and also when you speak, what we've been feeling. So can I ask you, why do you think that the Jewish community was not so well versed in this idea of internalized hatred?
I love that question. I think there's a couple of reasons. I think one, when you open Pandora's box, when we open Pandora's box, there is an enormous amount to deal with. And that's what that is part of the recognizing of internalized anti-Semitism, that there is trauma and there's a dynamic which exists between us and the wider world as the minority. So I think it's a very difficult thing to unpack, right? And also, we live in the world. I mean, you're a psychiatrist, right? It's like, yeah.
Psychotherapist, yeah, licensed clinical social worker.
So we live in a world where we talk about mental health, where we have conversations. I'm in therapy and I talk about it very openly and publicly because there's no taboo, or there's less taboo in our generation. I think about previous generations of Jews, this was not a conversation. And then also the events that were taking place. So whether it was the end of the Shoah or the founding of the State of Israel, it was about, okay, we need to get up and do. We need to rebuild our lives, or settle the refugees, or build a state. So it was always focused on doing and surviving. And I think that this, for whatever reason, I was able to have the space that you need to have these conversations, I guess, because I'd had it internally with regards to my gay identity. But also I think that it's scary. These are scary things to talk about. It's not an easy thing to dissect and analyze, because it's painful. Some of the people who have read my second book say to me afterwards, they're like, oh, I didn't enjoy it. They're like, I valued it, but it was not an easy or comfortable read, because I pose questions that are challenging, and questions, by the way, that I've had to answer myself. This is as much for me as it is for everyone else. And I think that we also, in Britain, there was a trend, and I think this existed in other places as well, but in Britain, there was a trend that was keep your head down. I was told this as a child, keep your head down, don't say anything. And I think that we are historically, or at least post-Holocaust, kind of nervous about rocking the boat, having conversations, because we want to just get on with things and kind of go through life and not have to deal with the ramifications of our experience. And the last thing I will say, I know I talk a lot, is the academic work on anti-Semitism has ignored this for the most part. There is really a handful of books about internalized anti-Jewishness, and so much of the academic work focuses actually on the non-Jewish ideas. So they think about, or they talk about, or analyze what was done to Jews, what was said about Jews, how we were treated. But even in the Holocaust, sometimes it's through the lens of the Nazis. And this again is part of the reclaiming of our story, is being able to say, no, this has an impact on us, on our psychology, on our mental health, our physical health, and we have to deal with it. We have to open the Pandora's box in a safe and secure way, with empathy, without shame, of course, so we can have the conversations as individuals facilitated by the collective.
Yeah, I think, you touch upon a very important thing. It's called Jewish Pride and Reclaiming Our Story. And it's not necessarily a quote unquote feel good book, because it's asking us to dig deep and do that hard work. But if we do all of that, we reap the benefits and rewards. And that's where all the beauty lies. So we're kind of like uncovering those diamond gems.
Absolutely. And you know, the thing that I always say to people regarding how I feel about anti-Semitism and homophobia as well is that I understand it has nothing to do with me or our community. If someone is awful, if someone accosts me in the street or makes a comment about my Magen David necklaces or my kippah that I'm wearing, or I just see something in London or in LA or wherever, I know this is their problem, because I've not internalized the idea that we are somehow to blame. And that is incredibly freeing. It doesn't mean that you don't feel pain. I think in some ways you feel more pain. You know, if you're a proud Jew, October 7th was a life event for us. I think if you're a Jew who's not so engaged, then it maybe have been less impactful. But even though it can be more painful because you're more switched on, you're more in tune with your identity, it is also at the same time freeing. I'm not looking internally. I'm not looking into our community. Sometimes people talk about it. They say, well, you know, Netanyahu. It's like, listen, there's different conversations to have. We can have a conversation about Netanyahu, but that is not necessarily the conversation to be had if we're talking about October 7th. And I mean by me to have this. There will be military experts and people to have those conversations, but for me, it's to talk about October 7th, the impact of us, why October 7th happened, you know, the roots of Muslim-Jew hatred, and also, again, the ramifications of us in the diaspora and in the state of Israel. But people always, the non-Jews, and do it, and sometimes the Jews do it. We look internally. But I understand fully that it's got nothing to do with us, and that's incredibly freeing. But I think you can only arrive there if you do the work, as you say.
Yeah, I think you mentioned this in your book, and we talked about this previously, that we do a good job of being introspective and blaming ourselves. It's something that we've been very good at for so long. And the other side, it does a very good job also of blaming us. So it becomes a chorus, right? And like you said, I think we really have to rely on our spidey senses, that some of these conversations that refocus or put the focus on Netanyahu is not in good faith. So engaging in that takes away from the real serious problems.
100%. And I think that, you know, we have a gut response. And we have it even often if we don't actually understand intellectually or academically the subject. I remember being at university, so I'm 37, so I was at Glasgow Uni 19 years ago. And Glasgow Uni was a version then of what people are experiencing now. I mean, buildings were taken over by pro-Palestinian supporters, activists. It was kind of hellish. And I had an emotional response to it. It made me feel sick, it made me feel isolated, but I couldn't have described that as anti-Zionism because that wasn't really the language that was used. But we do have to rely on our gut responses because they're often right. You know, there was an amazing book, you may have heard of it, called The Body Keeps Score.
Yeah.
It's really, and it does, our bodies hold on to our trauma and hold our experience. So if we're having a response to something, there's usually a reason for it. So we should not disregard it, because sometimes we do that. Oh, I'm just feeling nervous or being hysterical, because again, we're trying to put it down and we're not allowing ourselves to center our Jewishness and say, no, I need to listen to myself and respect my Jewishness and my experience.
Yeah, and I have so many questions to ask, and we have a lot of questions from the audience that they've asked as they've registered. If anyone has additional questions, feel free to put into Q&A, and we'll load it into the queue as we get to them. So this will be just a continuous flow of me asking my questions with other people's questions as well. So before I get to some of the other ones, because you brought up some comments that lead me to ask more questions, but before we get there, one of the main focuses of your second book is internalized Jew hatred, and I want to preface that words matter. For example, in modern times, we refer to some Jews as self-hating Jews, and a lot of people find this to be a harsh term that's not nuanced enough. So you describe this more in terms of internalized Jew hatred. So can you explain the term, why and how you came to this, and why it might be a better or more useful term?
Absolutely. So I came to it through my understanding of my own experience as a young gay person dealing with internalized homophobia. And I think that when we describe someone as a Jewish self-hater, I mean, actually, if we kind of get into, like, as you said, words matter, the meaning of the word, do most of these people hate themselves? No, they don't. There will be some people who do, and historically there were definitely some people who did, but it's not nuanced enough. It also doesn't, to me, pinpoint the source of the problem. We need to recognize that Jew hatred is a non-Jewish problem that obviously impacts us. I'm not saying it doesn't impact us. It becomes our problem, but it's not a problem that begins in our community. And that's the point. When we internalize it, which, by the way, I did. I'm not sitting here on a pedestal saying this was never my problem. I used to say to people, I'm Jewish, but I'm Zionist, but, because I was wanting to be a good Jew or a good Zionist in their eyes. And when we don't identify, or we don't use the language of internalized, we're ignoring the idea that it begins out with us and out with our community, and then we bring it into ourselves. And that is the whole point. And so much of the academic work surrounding this issue, because, by the way, it is not just a Jewish issue. Of course, I mentioned it with regards to the LGBTQ plus community, but also there's been really important research done within the Black community about this. And there are people who say that internalized anti-Black racism is one of the 3 main manifestations of anti-Black racism. So if it's true for them, why wouldn't it be true for us too? But we have to understand where it originates and also treat those who suffer from it. And I believe every Jew has the capacity to suffer from it, but treat those with empathy. Because in some ways they're victims. I said it, like, before, I think in our conversation before the call started, we're not victims. We're proud, strong survivors. We've been victimized, but we don't, in my opinion, have a victim identity. And we have to have empathy for those who have been warped and changed and, made almost into this gnarled tree by anti-Semitism, by Jew hatred. And that is how I see them. I feel sorry for them, and not in a patronizing way, because, again, it was my experience. That's not to say, of course, with regards to anti-Zionist Jews, that people, and all Jews really regarding this issue, are not responsible for the things they say and do. And we have to deal with individuals and hold them responsible for their actions. But we have to understand where this issue originates and understand that, in a sense, they're the victims, because they've been warped by it.
Yeah, I love that. Again, as words matter and clarifying where it comes from. This is the idea in therapy that we separate the person from the problem.
Yeah.
So I really love that idea. So you touched upon one of the points someone wrote, this is their problem, quote unquote. This is before you mentioned that, but it also becomes our problem. So you just talked about how that becomes our problem. And a little bit later, we'll talk more about the second part of her comment or question. But then I also want to say, you talked about keeping your head down. Now, this is something I read in your book, and in the past decades and so, because I went undergrad a while ago, this was the thing. I believe that the Jewish community, especially in colleges, always said, and one of my dear friends and colleagues will say this was her experience as well. She went to the leaders of these Jewish organizations on campus, et cetera, and that was what they said. And it wasn't necessarily they were trying to make her feel bad about it or shame her, but this is how I think we assumed we would get through it, right? Keep your head down, don't make it worse, and it will hopefully get better, or at least be status quo and not get worse.
Absolutely. And we have to understand, I do critique in the second book particularly kind of historic Jewish communities, particularly the American post-war and the German in the 19th century. And I say very clearly, I'm not here to judge them. I'm here to understand them, because they were acting in a specific context. Like, let's think about the American Jewish community, and, let's think about how it really came to prominence and had this kind of wave of acceptance from the 60s, when Jews could leave the ethnic enclaves, they could join the country clubs, go to the suburbs. But let's think about the 20 years that preceded that. It was post-Holocaust. We have to have empathy for the context in which we're in, because being overtly, loudly, specifically Jewish is frightening to some people, because particularly if we reference the Holocaust, that was scary. It's scary to put our heads above the parapet and say, I'm a Jew, because we know historically, and it's been proven today as well, that makes us vulnerable. it's frightening and it's existential. I think this is one of the things that Jews all over the world are having, this kind of emotional crisis because we're facing existential threat, or rather it feels like we are. And again, having empathy for ourselves, having that response, because given our history, of course, that makes sense that we would feel that way. But yeah, keeping your head down was the way they thought they would circumvent anti-Semitism. It was about getting around it. But we know, and we know now even more so, that we cannot. And listen, we can have a conversation about, is it the Jewish experience? Is this the eternal, is the Haggadah right? And it says every generation one rises up to destroy us. That's a different conversation, but it has certainly been the case. So yes, being someone who, like you did against Cooney, that is sticking your head above the parapet. You're marking yourself as a Jew in a world where being a Jew is essentially a handicap. And I know that that is quite an extraordinary thing for American Jews specifically to hear, because that wasn't really the case for this brief period of time, you know, from maybe the 1960s to the 2010s. But this, you know, post-Holocaust period, yeah, listen, again, we can have another, if you have me back, we can have another conversation about whether there was a golden age, but whatever it was, this period influenced all of our thinking, even us in Britain. We used to watch American Tail, and Fievel Mouskowitz sang "There's no cats in America and the streets are paved with cheese," and we understood exactly what that meant. So American Jews thought, we've made it. We've been the ones to circumvent this. And I think part of the shock and part of the tragedy of the current context is the realization that that is not the case.
Yeah, you make incredible points here. And the fact that your book is almost like an internal dialogue, and yet speaks for the internal dialogue that we're all having, right? The experiences that we've grown up in and seeing that change, as you're saying. Your book focuses again on this idea of internalized Jew hatred. So you say that with our actions, or with every choice we have, we can choose internalized Jew hatred or Jewish pride. I love that you distill it to these two choices. I have two questions. One is, how do we, with empathy, because we're coming hopefully from this with empathy, as you said, it's almost like we're experiencing it ourselves, or even when we look at past generations, we don't do it with judgment, but we try to understand it. So how do we, with empathy, and how do we do so collectively and individually to ensure that what we do as people is rooted in Jewish pride with all of the choices we make? So for example, do we, and if so, how do we include anti-Zionist Jews in the conversation? Sorry if I'm going to that place. Yeah. I mean, often when they speak, it negates every other Jewish experience, real ones. So is there space for that, and how does that look to you?
So there's a lot to unpack in this question, so I will do my best. You might have to remind me if I forget some of the questions. The first thing is, and this is what I do. So again, you spoke about it as my internal dialogue. It is. I'm also a Jew in the world experiencing this. I live in London. For any of you following the news, London is not a great place right now. It is kind of scary at times. So this dialogue is constantly going. And the question I ask myself is, have I treated my Jewishness with respect? So when I'm having a conversation with a non-Jewish person specifically, but also with other Jews, have I been self-deprecating in a way which is funny, or is it disrespectful? Have I diminished our specificity? Have I not stood up for myself? Have I kept my head down? Have I, not explained the power and the beauty in Jewish ritual? Have I allowed someone I'm speaking with to maybe be disrespectful without me saying, whoa there a second? So that's the question I ask myself. And listen, I'll say to you, there's sometimes I say, no, I didn't treat my Jewishness with respect. And I wrote the books about Jewish pride because this is an ongoing dialogue. Jewish pride ultimately is a journey without an end. Yes, it's a movement, but it's this internal work that we're always doing, especially because we live in the diaspora. Maybe in Israel, that's a slightly different conversation. But for those of us who live in the diaspora, as a minority, this is an eternal dialogue. So I ask myself that. And then the empathy piece. If I think, you know what, I didn't treat my Jewishness with the respect it deserves, I don't feel ashamed because I understand. And this again goes to that kind of acknowledge that I've done nothing wrong. although I'm responsible for my actions, I understand that I'm a Jew in most of these situations speaking to non-Jews. And it's not always easy, it's not always comfortable to be the minority. And it's sometimes you want to just not say anything, oh, I just want to get through this evening. But that's not always the right thing to do. But I don't blame myself because I understand why. I understand what it means to be a minority, that we are othered, we are made to feel less than. You know, I've had friends, not friends anymore, but friends talk about kashrut and say, oh, it's so stupid. It's not stupid. It's like one of our fundamental laws and has been present for 3,000 years. Like, what are you talking about? So it's about having empathy for yourself, understanding that while we're responsible for our actions, there's a greater context happening. So it's not that we're bad people, we're responding and we're navigating this context. And then lastly, about anti-Zionist Jews. So in the book, I am, I think, extraordinarily empathetic. I've really worked incredibly hard to be empathetic. And I will say that my position post-October 7th has hardened slightly. And it's not to say, I will preface what I'm about to say with the statement of, I always believe it's possible to come back to us, to come back to the fold. And I've seen people do it. A couple of people online and former anti-Zionist Jews have said, I was wrong and I'm sorry. And I think if someone says that, you say, no problem, come here, you give them a hug, because we're family and families fall out, but it's about coming back. However, I think there are specific anti-Zionist Jews, like the ones leading Jewish Voice for Peace, if not now, who I believe personally have strayed too far and who have, our tent is broad, but it's not that broad. Anti-Zionism to me is antithetical to Jewishness. Why? Because we're an indigenous people. So if we understand Zionism in terms of what it actually is, not in terms of the non-Jewish idea, which frames it as white supremacy, colonialism, imperialism, if we understand it as the movement of self-determination to return us to our indigenous land, then it's not possible to divorce that from Jewish identity, because you can say, listen, I'm an anarchist and I don't believe any country should exist. That's a bit weird to me, but whatever, you do you, right? That's not really anti-Zionism. But to say the Jews don't have a right to self-determination, no, that's racism, because it's singling us out, and it's also diminishing our classification as an indigenous people and our connection to that land. So I believe that we should cherem some of these people, and to make it clear to them and the wider world that this is not a Jewish position. These people still thankfully represent a fringe in our community, and they do not represent us, our ideas, and they are Jews with ideas, but they do not represent the Jewish community. Now, I understand there is no legal mechanism for cherem, so it's kind of like a theoretical proposition. But yeah, I think that we have to make it crystal clear, especially post-October 7th. I wrote an article in my column in the Jerusalem Post just after October 7th, and I reread it today, and it said that the time for ambiguity is over. And it's not that every Jew has to, you know, make Aliyah. I live in London, but I believe that understanding the place that Israel and the land of Israel has for the Jewish people is incredibly important to understanding Jewish identity. And we need to be very clear, as I said, that Jews who use their Jewishness as a weapon, because that's what they're doing. No, there's no quiet anti-Zionist Jews, right? They're not like, well, I don't agree with the state of Israel, but you do you. No, they want to tear the whole thing down, burn the house down, and they use their Jewishness as a way to kosher Jew hatred. And for some of these people, not all of them, but for some of them in leadership positions who are really pushing this agenda, yeah, we have to be very clear and very strong, in my opinion. And I know there'll be some people who disagree with me, and that's fine.
You know, I appreciate it in your book. You initially say in the second book that it was hard. You thought you would find more people who were anti-Israel or anti-Zionist, and initially you weren't finding that. But I appreciated that you included two testimonies that included people who identified it as anti-Zionist, and it gave me some more clarity or nuance to this idea of not necessarily throwing everybody out because they identify as anti-Zionist. So I think, like you said, it's to what extent they're at, and what they're using that for, how they're weaponizing, and you even speak about that as one of the major manifestations of internalized Jew hatred in your book, is this weaponizing of being a Jew.
Absolutely, and the ultimate, as I said with the second book, the ultimate aim is to guard against that. So we need to understand exactly what internalized anti-Jewishness is in all of its manifestations, including internalized Jewish anti-Zionism. We have to understand it so that we are able to guard against it, because that is we're at an organization called, or focused on campus. There are Jewish students, non-Jewish students too, but there are Jewish students who are going on campus and they're being radicalized. And I believe we should use that language. They're being radicalized because being a Jewish anti-Zionist is a radical position. It's illogical, it's self-defeating. But to understand why that's happening and to guard against it, we need to understand and unpack the phenomenon and kind of do it in a way, kind of objectively, like not be, obviously we're emotional, and I'm emotional about this because this is so important, but we also have to be able to take a little bit of a step back to understand it intellectually, academically, so that we can, why is this happening and how do we stop it happening? How do we stop the radicalization?
So another question about definitions. In your book, you mentioned the importance of Jewish anchors, not necessarily as a deterrent from Jew hatred from the outside world, but as a means essentially to cope through it and maintain a sense of who we are and hopefully gain a sense of pride in our Jewish identities. Can you speak more about that? And also, where does Jewish education and Israel fit into this quote unquote Jewish anchors?
So we all need to be anchored into our Jewishness. And we also need to be anchored into our other identities. I'm also gay, as I said. I have to be anchored into what that means for me. So I need to understand what it means to be Jewish and be grounded in it. And also, because of the specificity and the nature of what being Jewish is, there's a huge amount of action associated with it. So to me, Jewish action is part of what anchors us into our Jewishness, along with Jewish knowledge. So speaking of education, education is primary. We have to understand the Jewish story, and we have to be telling it, we have to be teaching it. And I think I will say, one of the mistakes, and again, I'm not saying it with judgment, but one of the mistakes that I have identified in the Jewish world was the sole focus of Jewish education through the realm of religion. Not that we shouldn't teach it, but I believe we should teach it alongside the idea of Jewish peoplehood. What does it mean to be Am? You know, we're Am Yisrael. What does that mean? What does it mean to be a people? Because that's not a categorization which really exists anymore. And we have, I think, let ourselves down by not teaching that, because then that gives us a route to talking about archaeology and talking about indigeneity and talking about our other connections with the land beyond the idea that God promised it to us. And I will say, I posted on Twitter the other day something about Judaism as our indigenous religion and how actually the stories contained within the Torah are incredibly important. And people pushed back at me and said, no, we don't justify our connection to Israel through the Torah. And I was like, no, you misunderstand. It's part of it. It's not that we only use that. But yes, the fact that we have a scroll, and some of us believe that it was, dictated by God, and some of us believe it was man-made, whatever. But we have a scroll which contains an explanation as to how Israel came to be ours, is supremely important. And if we look at other indigenous people, from Polynesia, for example, they also have ideas about their deities creating the world and giving them particular portions of it. It's important. It's part of the story, and we have to teach the whole story. And I don't believe that we have. We focused on one lens, and I myself am a secular Jew. So while I think it's important, the idea that God promised us the land is not something I believe actually happened. Although if you believe it, I respect your right to say that. So education is supreme. And Israel is central. And we do need to make a distinction between Eretz and Medinat, right? Eretz Yisrael and Medinat Yisrael. We are indigenous to Eretz Yisrael. Medinat, the state, is a modern polity which is Jewish, which sits on the indigenous land. So it's a continuation of this idea of Jewish sovereignty, but it's not that we're indigenous to Medinat Yisrael, because you can't really be indigenous to a state like that. So we're indigenous to Eretz, the land, But Israel is central, and I believe that all Jews, and I believe that all Jews should feel connected to Israel. I believe that all Jews should feel that Israel is at least one of their homes, because we are indigenous, and it would be unthinkable for the Maoris or Aboriginal tribes in Australia to feel disconnected to their respective territory, even if they live outside of the land. So Israel is central, but I do think that we in the diaspora have to have a conversation about the inherent tension which exists in being a diasporic people. And this is not just, by the way, our experience. There's a beautiful poem written by a Nigerian poet called Diaspora Blues. And essentially what she says is too foreign for home and too foreign for here. Because so I'll talk about myself. I'm British. And there's definitely aspects of British culture which I relate to and enjoy. But I don't really feel fully British. Why? Because I'm a Jew and I am connected to another land, but I'm not Israeli. So when I go to Israel, I'm super British because I'm like, why is no one queuing? And let's have a monarchy and blah, 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 blah. You're between two worlds. And the reality is we're at home in two worlds. It's not necessarily between, but we have to have that dialogue as a community and internally, about this experience. So Israel is central, absolutely.
I love that reframing. And again, constantly throughout your books and your talks, you reframe so many things again, putting the problem outside of us, and the way you just reframe this now, we're not between worlds, we have two homes. I love that. I think this is exactly what we need. The Jewish people need to understand that this is reclaiming the narrative. We need to understand this narrative. We need to internalize it. And I think that's so important because we have been internalizing the Jewish hate rather than our own story. So this reclaiming the narrative is so important. I've just been reading a lot of the questions, so I apologize if my eyes on the screen are flickering up and down as I go through it. But here's another question. There's an ongoing debate of how we as Jews and our allies should respond to anti-Semitism in the kindergarten through 12th grade school setting and on colleges and on college campuses. For example, and this is, I should preface by saying that we have a lot of students, alumni, faculty, and even community members, parents included, on this Zoom, and who will be watching this later. So should we take out all of our funding and donations, reject admissions into the colleges, teach elsewhere, etc.? This is for everyone, and it's not a catch-all, but some people might even say we make our own schools and colleges, as we did in the past, right? Yeah. So I know this is not necessarily black and white, but where do you stand on this?
So it's not black and white, and I absolutely understand both perspectives. I'll talk about mine. I don't go to parties I'm not invited to. So I was having this dialogue about Pride in London. It's Gay Pride in London this Saturday, and the Jewish LGBTQ+ organization is not marching. And there's a conversation about whether they should march. I don't want to go and spend time in spaces that don't want me. I really actually find it humiliating. I wrote a column about this. The idea that I have to fight to stay in Britain is a humiliation. I'm British. I was born in Britain. I have a British passport. I'm British. Why am I fighting? To me, that's a humiliation being hoisted on us. So my perspective is we absolutely withdraw our funding. I believe that we as a community should be creating funds, scholarship funds for our students, because it's not that every university in the United States is bad. There are some which are bad, there's some which are less bad, and there's some which are quite supportive. So what we need to be doing is supporting our allies, and we need to enable young Jews to go to the schools which are going to be doing their duty of care, because that's what this is, right? I was a teacher. It's a duty of care. They're failing in their duty of care to our students and the faculty. So yeah, I believe that we should hit them where it hurts and withdraw funding. We should stop going. They should not be able to use our last names on their alumni pages to say that, look how well our alumni have done when they've abused us. I don't give a penny to Glasgow University. And they email asking for money. I'm like, absolutely not. I was tormented at Glasgow Uni, and there was one professor who supported me out of the many I had contact with. No, they're not getting a penny from me. And listen, I understand that some people say they want to fight for a seat at the table. I understand that. To me, it's just a question of, is there actually a seat at the table, or are we just engaged in a kind of self-flagellation? It may be that this situation changes, though. So then the question is, do we go back if we have left, or do we continue to stay? Listen, I think that everyone has to make their own decision, but I think that we have to open the dialogue and legitimize the idea of putting Jewish people first. There's a British election next week. I will be, and I say this to all of my friends, I'm a single issue voter. And I say to them, if they kind of take umbrage with that, and I understand why they do, because honestly, Britain's a bit of a mess right now. And I was like, if you don't want me to be a single issue voter, then you need to create a world where I don't need to be. I have to look out for me. I have to look out for my community because no one else is. And I believe that we're allowed to be selfish. It gets a bad reputation, but we're allowed to be inward looking. And yeah, I would not give a penny to UPenn or Columbia or Harvard or Yale or any of these schools. And we should be, yeah, it's kind of an extreme, I guess, argument to create our own, but we have the brilliance, we have the brains, why not? But if we do it, we have to keep hold of them, because look at Brandeis, right? We did it, and then the values change over time. And it's to say, even if we did start our own universities, our own high schools, it's not that we don't allow non-Jews to join. We absolutely allow non-Jews to join. This is not about ghettoization. It's about creating safe spaces where actually critical thinking is promoted, which is what academia is meant to do. It's meant to, that's the focus. So these universities are failing in their duty of care to us, they're failing in the duty of care to their non-Jewish students, and they are insulting the very idea of academic conversation and dialogue. So yeah, I feel very strongly about them. And again, I know that some people will disagree. And listen, it's up to you. But yes, I think the big donors, absolutely, withdraw your money, 100%.
You know, I'm going to out my university, my alma mater. It was called Silberman School of Social Work. The Silbermans were ardent Zionists, and ironically, that is where so much anti-Zionist propaganda and hate happens. It's terrible. Also, as you said, the single issue voter. You know, I found this happen with me, and my friend and I were talking about that. I was saying, you know, as a gay man and as a Jew, I have to decide now my Jewish rights or my Jewish existence or my gay rights. And she was saying the same thing as rights as a woman and as a Jew. And it's very sad that we have to almost like choose between our identities.
Absolutely. And the thing, just to say very quickly, the thing that we must understand in those dialogues, which by the way I think are happening all over the world, is that they are a damning indictment on the world around us. It's not our fault. And listen, I'm not here to say that Jews don't have things as a community that we can improve on. Jewish pride is that's part of Jewish pride, that we do work on ourselves. But that specific idea that we're between these two identities or two worlds, no, it's not our fault. It's a stain on the humanity of the majority.
Yeah, exactly. And I just want to be mindful of the time. We have about 7 minutes left, and then I'm going to turn it over to you, Ben, for final thoughts. But so we have a bunch of questions. So talking about the university settings and knowing that this is an Alums for Campus Fairness program, in your opinion, what role do alumni play in fostering a positive environment for Jewish students and even for faculty, an environment for Jewish faculty and our allies on campus?
I think number one, you have to stay part of the community. It's if you're interested in the Jewish life on your campus, you have to stay, or your previous campus, you have to stay involved, you have to stay part of the community. And there should be an ongoing dialogue, and there should be, you know, it's the kind of traditional idea is that students are kind of broke and they have no money and they're kind of, you know, living their best lives and they're 10 people in one apartment. But we, the alumni, we've worked, we're professionals, so we need to support them. We need to support them materially. We need to support them with community, and we need to put pressure on the universities and use every tool in our arsenal, again, including our wallets. It's kind of insane that you just mentioned a university or a department which has a Jewish name on it, which is being used to oppress Jewish people and harm Jewish people. It's unthinkable. It's crazy. And we need to hit them where it hurts and use pressure. And, you know, it's not necessarily that we'll have to do that in every case. Sometimes it's just maintaining a dialogue with the deans, with the presidents, with the faculty. But yeah, we have to stay involved and we have to keep a watchful eye on what is happening and offer support in any way that we can.
Awesome, thank you. And this is a good time to plug Alums for Campus Fairness. I don't work for them. I am a lay leader. I'm just a person in the community who has seen what happened on the college campus at the school I went to. And I said, this is completely unacceptable. I reached out to students and I didn't know what to do. Alums for Campus Fairness has an incredible network and resources. So if anyone is interested, like I was, reach out to Melanie or Trey and say, how can I get involved? That's the way we start the conversation. I think, like you said, Ben, we can offer things based on ourselves as professionals, mentors, etc. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Another question that people had was, how do we crack down, someone said specifically at CUNY, how do we crack down on Jew hatred on college campuses? It's a little bit more of a specific question about cracking down on the hate.
The universities need to understand what anti-Semitism and Jew hatred is, and they don't. An example, not from a campus, but I'm sure it's one that will relate to the campus experience. In Edinburgh, which is the capital of Scotland, there's an area called Leith. It's a part of the city, and people have been putting up signs in windows saying, make Leith a Zionist-free zone. The police do not understand that that is anti-Jewish and that that's a hate crime. So what we need to do is make sure that the universities, it's not just about the adoption of IRA. That was a focus for a while, and we really wanted all the universities to adopt IRA, but then it was kind of like, okay, well, what else? They need to understand, they need to be involved in training, and this is also something that alumni can kind of be part of, putting forward ideas, educating. The universities need to understand that anti-Zionism is racism, and Jews alone get to define the Jewish experience. We will not be told by non-Jews what it means to be a Jew or what it means to have the Jewish experience. So that's the first step. And then, yes, we have to be pushing for there to be accountability. Students, I think back at myself, like students are young and we did stupid things, right? That's what you do when you're a student. It's kind of your right as a young person to make mistakes and to learn. But those mistakes do not extend to calling for genocide. Standing in your university park, in your garden, in the courtyard, and calling for the genocide of a people or calling for the destruction of a country, I believe that those students should be expelled. They should have their degrees cancelled. Even if they were 1 minute from graduation, it should be cancelled. There needs to be consequences to Jew hatred, social as well as other. And there was some kind of dialogue happening about specific leaders during the encampment movement, a few weeks ago. And it was like, yeah, good luck to them getting a job. And listen, we have to allow people to grow and change. This is not necessarily about cancel culture, but people need to be held accountable for making Jews, who, by the way, built academia and who funded many of these institutions, unwelcome. No, it's unacceptable. And we need to push the universities. And what you did, Michael, if necessary, yes, I believe that we should sue, because they are failing in their duty of care. I was a teacher. I worked at schools and universities. You're first and foremost, you have a duty of care to your students to make sure that they're happy and healthy and able to learn. And they failed in a spectacular fashion.
So being mindful of time, I know we have a handful more questions, but I'm going to unfortunately not be able to ask them, but maybe I can pose them, Ben, to you at a later time, and whatever you can answer, I'll be able to share with those who attended. But I just want to ask now, outside of the university setting or the school setting, there are a lot of people who want to know what they can do when they're confronted with anti-Semitism or Jew hatred on the streets or in social media. For example, something as little as someone tearing down posters or flyers on the streets. Some people are asking, like, what can we do in general, and how do we deal with that?
So I think the number one thing is we have to understand what is happening and understand our story. So it goes back to education. If we're in a conversation, even if it's not a dialogue, if we're in a conversation with a non-Jewish person who says that Israel is an apartheid state, we need to know why that is false. So we have to be educated. I always say, before you raise your voice up, particularly online, we have to know what we're talking about. So we need to understand, and I think that's why an organization like ACF could be so important, because you have the resources. There are people with the knowledge. If your members are not necessarily so knowledgeable at the moment. And there's no shame in that, by the way. We're always learning. I was a teacher, again, lifelong learners. I think that number one, if we see something, we have to report it. So that could be to your Jewish community. It could be to the police. they need to understand what's happening. The police are particularly important because they're tracking hate crimes. So I was accosted in London, and I spoke to the police, and it was lodged as an official hate crime, and then that is added to the statistics. And I think if you feel safe and if you feel comfortable, and I want to say that again, if you feel safe and if you feel comfortable, then you can say something. But you may not be safe, you may not feel comfortable, and there's no shame in that. It's okay to not feel that you want to interact with someone who's being awful and anti-Jewish on the street. It's okay to say no. If you are able to film it, I would do that because, again, it gathers evidence. But if you're able to have an interaction, the interaction is not necessarily to change this person's mind. It's to show the people watching, and there usually will be people watching, that there is a different perspective. And again, we're Jews, we have a right to stand up for ourselves, but there's no shame in not feeling safe and comfortable. But raising your voice online, I mean, there's 2 wars happening right now. I mean, maybe 3, to be honest. 2 of them, one of them is definitely in southern Israel, maybe one will be with Hezbollah, but we're at war too in the diaspora, and our war is being fought online, on college campuses, on the streets, and we need to raise our voices. We need to come together in community. We need to say that we will not tolerate this. And it's not that we're begging for acceptance, but we're damning the people who don't accept us. We're saying, no, this is a stain on your humanity. It's, as I said, a damning indictment. And the online community is really amazing. You know, Twitter is kind of a cesspit, I will say, but I was a Jew living in Hong Kong in a very small Jewish community, and I connected with you, Michael, with Jews all over the world because of social media. So being part of that dialogue is really can be, not always, but can be a wonderful thing. But raise your voice. And the last thing I would say is be actively Jewish. Since, you know, after October 7th, I kind of messaged my partner to be like, I was away on tour in North America, and I think that's when you and I met up, Michael. We went for breakfast. But I said to my partner, oh, there's a big package coming for me, and I love to shop, so packages often come. And he's like, what did you buy? And I was like, it's an insanely big order of Judaica. Because the urge I had after October 7th, after I cried, after I understood what was happening, was to live my Jewishness. And since October 7th, I wrote the book about Jewish pride, and I have increased my Jewish action to be grounded, anchored into our Jewishness, so that our identity is not defined by what they do to us or what they say about us. It's defined by our experience, by our knowledge and our actions. So lighting the Shabbat candles, having mezuzot, lighting Chanukiot, whatever, what you find what works for you. But it's a beautiful salve to reclaim our relationship with ourselves and our Jewishness and each other.
I think that's a beautiful note to end on. I will say, Ben, there are a million questions. I love when you speak. I love reading your words. It's just so important. I feel like we could just go on and on. In the interest of time, I'm going to say thank you to ACF for hosting this program. Ben, thank you so much for being here with us, sharing your expertise and your time. Everyone who was a part of this live webinar and everyone who's viewing this recording, thank you all so much. If you have more questions, I urge you to pick up Ben's books. They are an incredible read, and your questions at the end of your second book, Ben, it's like daily meditations to kind of confront ourselves and start that healing process, I would say, to reclaiming that narrative. So I look forward to more. I hope we will do another one because really the questions are just all here. But with that, I just want to say thank you so much, Ben. Thank you everyone for being here, and I hope to see you next time. Take care and be well.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for having me.